Welcome to Lighten Up, a show about bringing more love, light, and joy into your life, and archived on the Lighten Up program page. Now the host of Lighten Up, Isabel Merians.
Welcome to Lighten Up with Isabel, your good news show, and today I have lots of good news to share with you. The best news is my beautiful guest, plus the beginning of a new series. The new series is called Woman Invictus, which means woman undefeated. Actually, the assault on women's rights and health is severe and ongoing. And although women have made great strides, I think this is a serious subject that needs to be addressed. This series will deal with how male-dominated societies, Jewish, Christian, and Islam, overthrew matriarchal society and began the repression of women. I found that the sex of the God being worshipped determines women's place in society. But first, let me introduce Charlene Vannucci.
Hi.
Hello. A wonderful friend. Charlene is a professor at Long Island University, and in addition to teaching there, she is also a dancer, a spiritual teacher, and a Reiki master. So she's really well equipped to discuss this with me.
Oh, thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you
My
for inviting
pleasure.
me.
It's my great pleasure.
You know, you actually are the perfect person to discuss the divine feminine. I don't know if your audience knows this, but Isabel Merians is the author of this book, Harlots and Heresy. Provocative title, provocative stories, and a provocative author, if I may say so.
Thank you. Well, that's very, very kind of you.
It's a story of power and passion. It's beautifully written. It's actually impossible to put down, quite frankly. And the messages inside are still as relevant today as ever because women are still trying, or really fighting, to claim, reclaim, and hold on to their power.
Absolutely.
Tell us how this book came to be written, Isabel.
Well, I was always fascinated with early religion, and after reading the Bible, Sumerian text, and many, many different books on early religion, I found out that for about 25,000 years before the ancient Hebrews or the Christians or Islam, God was worshipped as female. The earliest people saw that only women gave birth, and therefore they reasoned that only a goddess could have given birth to the universe. And that was quite a beautiful concept because the way they perceived it is that the goddess was in all things, in each of us, in all living things, in the stones, in the wind, in the sun, in the galaxies. Everything on earth and in the universe was part of the great goddess, which was, I think, a very beautiful way of viewing it. And I realized that during that period of time, women were of high estate. Women were lawgivers. They were religious leaders. They worked in the marketplace. All property was passed down matrilineally, which was really quite fascinating. And so anyhow, it occurred to me that what happened eventually was these rather peaceful people were invaded many times by northerners. They were called Indo-Aryans that came down from northern Europe. And then also at a later time by Hebrews, who were an ancient tribe of Semitic people who came up from the south. And the matriarchy was gradually being diminished as these people, as these invaders came in wave after wave and gradually suppressed the goddess worshippers. And so it occurred to me that the Bible was actually being written during the time of these women that I write about in Harlots and Heresy. And of course, there was great conflict between the two. When the matriarchy was being overthrown, at first, the gods of the invaders and the goddess were worshipped jointly. But as male dominance became more prevalent, the suppression of the goddess became greater and greater. And eventually, the goddess worship was prohibited and suppressed completely. And of course, as women lost more and more of their power, they were reduced from being in very high places to being mere chattel. So that's how I felt very passionate about getting their stories out.
I could see why. There is a stark contrast between the patriarchal rule society and the goddess worship society, and you can see that in the book.
Right, of course. Well, the goddess society, it's rather interesting. The goddess worshippers believed that sexual love was so sacred and so important. It was taught in the temples themselves. When patriarchy was established and the fierce male god was established, women no longer could practice those rites in the temple, and chastity was demanded of them. And if they were not chaste, they could then be stoned to death. So they were terrified. Their power had been taken away. Their sexuality was in question. And it's interesting because Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, loved men who had many wives, like Solomon and David, who had hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines, yet the woman was always to be chaste. And that comes out in the book as well.
Yes. It's interesting. The book is written, it's a novel, and there are different stories of different women throughout the book, which is very interesting. And you can see in the stories in the book, for example, in the first story of Lilith, the goddess-based society is very different. They're promoting love, they're promoting sexual pleasure, joy, they celebrate nature, music, art, and there was education for everyone.
Right.
For everyone.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
then in the patriarchal society, seen as in Salome, these things were reserved for the privileged few, and most of the privileged few were men.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, what I attempted to do was to take the, quote, bad women of the Bible and rewrite their stories from the perspective, because they're considered evil or harlots in the Bible. Rewrite it from the perspective that they were goddess worshippers, and if they didn't comply with the strict Levite laws, they were considered evil and treacherous. So this is what I attempted. The first story of Lilith, of course, Lilith is the high priestess, which was the highest honor in the land. And I actually, using my research, utilized telling her story, embellished by the customs of the country. The high priestess chose a lover each year who was called her king. He served for 1 year, and then he was gotten rid of, because anyone who had ever had sexual contact, sexual expression with the high priestess was no longer allowed to be with another woman, because that was considered sacred. And I addressed that. I addressed the customs of the society at that time. And of course, Lilith, at the height of her power, meets someone who is a representative of the invaders, the Indo-Aryans, and unfortunately falls madly in love with him and gives up her power to go back with him to his country. And of course, they determine that as a result of that, her name has to be obliterated. She's only mentioned twice in the Holy Bible,
Oh my goodness.
and always in a negative way. And it was said that she, to make her sound really evil, it was said that she flew away and lived by the Red Sea, where she coupled with demons and gave birth to 100 children a day. And supposedly God sends angels to bring her back into the fold, and she curses the angels and curses God as well. So that was as bad a rap as you could possibly get.
I would say.
Couldn't get much better. And the other women, I describe in varying degrees, and you begin to see the lessening. She gave up her power.
Yes.
But the others, you begin to see the lessening of their powers.
Yes.
Delilah, of course, to me was a tragic character. If you know the story of Samson and Delilah, I'm sure you do, Samson's first wife was killed by the Philistine lords and her own people because they were displeased with her. And of course, my belief is that they were going to do the same thing to Delilah if she had not gotten the secret of Samson's strength. However, to make her sound evil, they have the... And remember, history is always written by the winners. What they do with her, the authors of the Bible, have her sell him out for silver.
Right.
So I thought that was quite relevant. Let's see, who comes after? I'm trying to remember. After Delilah is...
Well, Salome, I believe.
Salome, right.
But even Jezebel.
Well, Jezebel also. Jezebel was still trying to maintain the goddess religion, and she was given as part of a bargain to King Ahab of Israel as his wife. She herself was furious at the concept because she was not in love with Ahab, which she thought was a right. If it had been in earlier times, she would have chosen
Exactly.
her own lover and so forth. And so she was really furious about that. But she really tried to maintain, she brings the worship of the goddess into Israel, which is why she is considered so evil and treacherous. Now, of course, the people in Israel remembered when they still baked cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And so they were okay with that, of having the two, Yahweh and the goddess coexist.
At that time.
At that time. And of course, her husband, Ahab, is challenged by one of the prophets, Elijah, who says to him, you can't worship, no man, you're building temples to Baal, her, the consort of the goddess. And he said, no man can possibly worship two masters. And King Ahab says to him, oh, yes, I can. But, of course, that doesn't go over too well with Elijah, and he inflames the people against them. And eventually they have to send him into exile. Jezebel does. And then, of course, there's the famous story of Jezebel getting the vineyard for Ahab that he wants with Naboth, which I think many people who've read the Bible will know about. But Ahab attempts to buy the vineyard from Naboth, and Naboth says to him, according to patriarchal law, all land is to be passed down. It's not to be sold or swapped. And he won't comply with Ahab's wishes. And Ahab starts sulking, and he won't eat, and he's miserable. And Jezebel says to him, aren't you the king? Can't you do something? This is ridiculous. You're not even eating. She says, don't worry, my husband. Get up, have dinner, and I will get Naboth's vineyard for you. And instead of questioning her or asking, well, how are you going to manage this when I can't? He says, fine, my dear. And he goes about his business. And then a couple of days later, she says to him, go, my husband, and take the vineyard that you wanted. Naboth is dead. And he's totally stunned. And of course, what she did is she wrote a letter to all of the leading lords and told them that Naboth was treasonous and had spoken out against the king, and it was now his for the taking. And for them to have a dinner and invite Naboth to accuse him and then to stone him to death. So that was pretty rough. And then she prays to the goddess and asked forgiveness, because that was not the way they usually did things.
No, that's right.
So that was pretty dramatic stuff.
I thought it was interesting that, you know, even today we'll say, oh, she's a Jezebel,
Right.
you know. And meanwhile, she was true to her husband throughout the time they were married, and the goddess. And yet her husband had how many other wives?
Well, he had 70 sons by concubines. And it was really interesting because Athaliah gave birth. He very much wanted a son.
Right,
And she gave birth to a daughter
right.
named Athaliah. And he always would say to her, well, next time, he'd look at the baby and he'd say, well, the next one will be a boy. But Athaliah was the rightful heir to his throne, because she was the only legitimate heir. And I bring that out, and many people don't know this fact, but Athaliah is the only woman to ever have ruled Israel alone. There was never another woman. She ruled for almost 7 years. And she was a very interesting historical character. It's mentioned in the Bible that Athaliah did rule the land. And it's very interesting because in my book, In Harlots and Heresy, I bring out the fact that Athaliah, well, first I have to backtrack because Ahab is killed in a war, and Jehu, who is his leading general, comes back afterwards with the funeral cortege to, bury him back, brings him back to Jerusalem. And Jezebel is really terrified of Jehu because she knows he's very powerful, and he always hated the goddess worshippers. So when she knows he's coming, and so she thinks that if she can make herself appealing in his eyes, perhaps he'll deal with her kindly. And she looks out the window when he approaches, and he's under the window, and he stops. And she says something to him. And instead of answering her, he turns around and he spits on the ground to show his disdain. And she gets really furious, and she says to him, "So, is it treason then, And he gets furious, and he screams. She's surrounded by several eunuchs. And he says, throw her down, throw her down. And she was up on a higher level. And I will reward whoever does so. And these people take her, and they throw her out the window. And the Bible says that she's trampled by the horses, and that the dogs lick up her blood, and that he then goes to eat and drink his fill, but he says to his men, go back and bury her. After all, she is the daughter of a king. So, of course, Athaliah at that time was a young girl and was terrified and goes into hiding. And in my book, I have her hidden among Bedouin tribes who befriend her. And she's taken in, and she's safe there. And the man who takes her tells her that when conditions politically quiet down, he will come back for her.
Right.
And she lives with the Bedouins and learns their ways and is very grateful. And some years pass until I think she was about 18. And this man comes back and tells her, informs her that the situation has quieted down, and that the people who were supportive of her parents are now back in power, and it's safe for her to come back. And she goes back with him, but she remains in hiding because she doesn't know, enemies lurk around every corner. And during this time, she meets with the elders who are, knowledgeable, with the heads of state, with men who were loyal to her mother and father. She learns about issues of state. She learns about everything from where the next well should be dug. They inform her on all matters of state and custom. And she begins trying to find her voice, because now she has to speak decidedly and strongly in front of groups. So she practices everything, reading anything out loud to find her own voice and begin to feel her own power. And she has a friend among her very old nurse who took care of her, who was very kind to her and always encouraged her and always says to her, remember, the blood of kings flows through your veins.
Yes.
Always be mindful of this. And so gradually she begins to be able to feel her own strength and her own power and the fact that these people believe in her. And so eventually she is installed once again as the king, not the queen.
Right,
they call
the
her
king.
the king. And she rules over the land for almost 7 years. And during that time, unfortunately, there was a very severe drought in Israel. And the crops are withering and animals are dying. And, they come to her and they say, you must do something. Because she had again instituted the worship of the god and the goddess in the temples. And they said, perhaps Yahweh is furious at us now for worshiping the goddess again. You must do something. So she decides to have a great festival and to bring back the ancient festivals of the goddess. And she orders many sacrifices, oxen and sheep and so forth, to be sacrificed. And she also brings back the ancient sexual practices for this particular propitiation service. And so everyone goes, and everyone chooses a partner. She chose a very handsome young athlete as her partner for the evening, and they practice the sacred sexual rites in hopes that that will suffice the goddess and that she will again smile on them and bring rain, which was part of the natural ceremony. So at any rate, this takes place, and unfortunately there is no rain. But before the sacred sexual practices, she speaks to all of the people. And she says the worship of the god and the goddess are like two sides of the same coin. It is only by the uniting of the male and the female that is going to bring balance to the land. And I want you to be mindful of this. And then, of course, there are the sexual rites.
Right.
And then when no rain comes, the people rebel against her and against the goddess worshippers once again. And she is taken out to where the area called the Horse Gate, and she is murdered, and the worship of the goddess is no more. So I also would like to say that obviously I am not suggesting anyone worship patterns be changed. However, I am saying that the feminine, and of course today we have the rise once again of women warriors. We even have Wonder Woman on the big screen.
That's right.
And the Women's March in Washington. So women are once again standing up and saying, we don't want what has been forced upon us by these patriarchal religions. And as far as, again, closing women's centers, women's health centers, and stopping funding for Planned Parenthood is not where we should be at this point in time. So women are saying, look, let's be mindful of both the male and the feminine. And the sacred feminine is coming to the fore more and more.
It's interesting in the book, Isabel, you do get to see the strength of each of the women in the stories, from the very first story right through all the other stories, and how they are forced to deal with the situations, but they have that inner strength throughout.
Right.
And I think that's very beautiful. It comes across, and you see it today too.
Absolutely.
With women all the time in the news.
Yeah. Well, there is actually an American Indian woman who is up for canonization, which I was really delighted to see. I had no knowledge of that when I do my research. I'm never quite sure of what I'm going to run across. But I think women who have been the nurturers, who've been the caregivers, who have now certainly in the marketplace, in business, are coming to the fore. They're women CEOs. I happen to know quite a few. There are women who are taking their place in society in a very meaningful way. And as I said, I'm not suggesting that people go back to the worship of a goddess any more than I'm suggesting that they worship a specific god. I'm simply suggesting that the unification of the male and female. And I am also saying that this series is going to address how best to do that. So I would really be grateful, Charlene, if you would read the goddess's opening statement in the book. I would appreciate that.
I hope I do it justice. It's very powerful. This, I don't know if we didn't mention that Harlot's Heresy was made into a play, actually.
Oh, that's
we
right.
should mention that because
it was indeed.
I had the pleasure of seeing it read by the goddess
and
on stage here.
Yes, well, we were very fortunate. The very talented Richard Quinn presented it here at the Nyack Village Theater. And it was actually, the play had been commissioned by a Broadway producer who fell in love with the book. And I had written the play for her, basically for her.
Right.
It was a woman. And unfortunately, we couldn't agree on an ending. But Richard was brilliant enough to see the potential and produced it, for which I'm very grateful.
And before we just move forward, I wanted to ask you, how was the play received? I know there were accolades, but do you think the message came across to the audience when it was presented live?
Well, people said that it was. As a matter of fact, one woman was really adorable. She said to me, I'm going to go back and reread my Bible. She said, I've known it was this dramatic. She said, I will have to go back and find those parts. So, yes, it was very well received. Thank you. However, this program is getting the message to many more people than I could possibly have gotten it out to.
Well, we're going to be looking forward to your next installment and the next and the next and the next.
Oh, thank you.
So, as the goddess, I am the queen of heaven. I am from everlasting to everlasting. I dreamed the universe into being. I weave the destinies of men and of nations into the tapestry of my gown. Galaxies spiral into being when I loose my hair. I dance and new life comes forth. My laughter is music in the spheres. When I sorrow, there is torrential rain. When I am gladdened, the sun warms the earth. My anger triggers volcanoes, and my calm brings soothing night. I created all laws and rule all realms. I know the secret hearts of men. Truth and wisdom course through my veins. When I speak, the hosts of heaven attend me. My names are legion. I have been called the divine ancestress of 1,000 names, light of the world, leader of hosts, forgiver of sins, righteous judge, wielder of death, valiant warrior, Isis, Ishtar, Astarte, Diana, Tara, and Mary are but a few. I have also been called the great whore of Babylon and the great mother of harlots. I have been worshipped and despised, loved and abhorred. My daughters, high priestess all, have long been celebrated in myth and legend. They have also been reviled as evil and treacherous in my service. I dedicate this book to righting their wrongs and to clarifying certain misconceptions. In my kingdom of light, truth burns away heresy. As I begin the telling of our stories, I smile, and the planets align like a vast string of pearls against a dark sky.
Thank you.
And I
Thank
have
you.
goosebumps. These words are so beautiful,
Well,
Isabel.
thank you. That's very kind, and you read it very beautifully.
Thank
you
you.
so much. Well, that concludes our very first series in the new shows. And I thank my audience so much for joining us today. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Until next time, remember to live a more joyous life. Lighten up.